Nurse, I don't care what they taught you in nursing school. Here, you fetch coffee and change bedpans until I say otherwise. Is that clear? The crowd of residents and senior nurses, a small constellation of tired eyes and blue scrubs orbiting the chaotic center of the ER nurses station, offered a few nervous chuckles. They were practiced, these chuckles, honed by months or years of exposure to the abrasive brilliance of Dr. Adrian Thorne. They were the sounds of people who knew their place in the rigid hierarchy he cultivated, a place far beneath his own self-perceived altitude. The new nurse, Alara Vance, offered no reaction. Her face, framed by wisps of brown hair that had escaped a ruthlessly tight bun, remained placid, her gaze steady. She simply stood there, a small, unassuming figure in crisp, new scrubs that still held their factory folds, her hands clasped loosely in front of her. Her silence was a strange, dense thing in the cacophony of beeping monitors, rattling gurneys, and Thorne's booming voice. It wasn't defiant, nor was it submissive. It was observational, an unnerving stillness that seemed to absorb the sound around it. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Yes, doctor, but when the chief of surgery, a man who had seen 3 decades of medical professionals come and go, later passed by and saw her stance as she inventoried a crash cart, he paused. It was something in the economy of her movements, the way her hands located each item without looking, the methodical precision that was less about following a checklist and more about instinct, about a deep, cellular memory. It was the posture of someone who wasn't just stocking a cart, but preparing a battlefield. If you believe that true competence needs no announcement, type quiet professional below. The air in the St. Michael's Level 1 Trauma Center was a thick soup of antiseptic, desperation, and burnt coffee. For Dr. Thorne, it was the atmosphere of his kingdom. He thrived on the pressure, the life and death decisions made in seconds, the sheer, unadulterated chaos that he alone could orchestrate into a symphony of survival. He was, by all accounts, a brilliant diagnostician and a gifted surgeon. But his brilliance was matched only by his ego, a colossal, fragile thing that required constant feeding. He saw the world through a lens of credentials and titles, a pecking order he sat firmly atop. Alara Vance, fresh from orientation, didn't even register on that scale. To him, she was a blank slate, another cog in the machine he commanded. He had made it his personal mission on her first day to etch his authority onto that slate. Vance, he'd barked earlier, holding up an empty coffee mug. Priority 1. She had been in the middle of checking the pediatric intubation kit, her brow furrowed in concentration, but she had stopped immediately, taken the mug, and returned with it filled, placing it on his desk without a word before returning to her kit. He found her silence irritating. He was used to a certain level of nervous energy from new staff, a flustered desire to please. Alara's calm was a void he couldn't understand, and therefore couldn't trust. He interpreted it as insolence, or worse, incompetence masked by passivity. The public dressing down at the nurse's station was a calculated move, a demonstration for the benefit of the entire floor. It was meant to establish dominance, to make it clear that his word was law and her role was to obey it without question. The laughter of the others was the confirmation he sought. They understood the rules. He watched her now as she moved to the linen closet, her steps measured, her focus absolute. She was a ghost, leaving no wake in the turbulent currents of the ER. She was invisible, and that was exactly how he wanted her. He failed to notice the details that the old chief of surgery had seen. He didn't see that her eyes were constantly scanning, not just the room, but the people in it, assessing their stress levels, their movements, their efficiency. He didn't see that when she organized the 4-star kits, she arranged them not by the hospital's standard protocol, but by a far more logical, intuitive system for rapid deployment in a mass casualty scenario. He saw a new nurse fetching supplies. He failed to see a seasoned operator preparing her environment for a war she knew was always just one siren away. Her past was a locked box, and he had no interest in the key. He had made his assumption, and for a man like Adrian Thorne, an assumption was as good as a fact. This assumption, a towering monument to his own arrogance, was about to be leveled to the ground. He was about to learn that in the world of true professionals, the quietest person in the room is often the most dangerous. The moment of reckoning arrived not with a warning, but with a sudden, overwhelming wave of noise and blood. The call came from dispatch, a clipped, frantic voice cutting through the relative lull of the afternoon. Multi-vehicle pileup, I-85. A charter bus is involved. We're looking at 50-plus victims. Multiple red tags. ETA to St. Michael's. Now. The words hung in the air for a second, a death sentence for the day's peace. Then chaos erupted. It was a flash flood of humanity and trauma. Gurneys slammed through the automatic doors, each one bearing a broken body. Screams mixed with the urgent shouts of paramedics reciting vitals and injuries. The clean, sterile floor was suddenly slick with blood and saline. Dr. Thorne, for all his arrogance, was in his element, or so it seemed. He stood at the center of the storm, a conductor trying to wield a hurricane. Give me a chest tube in Bay 3. Where's ortho? I need a fast exam in 5. Somebody page cardiothoracic now. But his commands, usually so sharp and precise, were becoming frayed. The sheer volume was too much. His system, built on his own central authority, was breaking down. He was trying to micromanage a dozen critical cases at once, and he was losing. Nurses scrambled, residents looked panicked, and vital seconds were being lost to confusion and duplicated efforts. In the midst of this maelstrom, Elara Vance moved with a chilling, almost supernatural calm. While others ran, she walked with purpose. While others shouted, she was silent. Her eyes, narrowed in focus, swept across the incoming tide of patients, not as a nurse seeing victims, but as a triage officer categorizing threats. She saw the subtle pallor of internal bleeding, the telltale flailed chest of a driver who'd hit a steering wheel, the paradoxical breathing of a tension pneumothorax. She wasn't just seeing injuries. She was seeing mechanisms, trajectories, and probabilities. She ignored Thorne's chaotic orchestra and began her own silent symphony of life-saving. She bypassed the overwhelmed supply closet, instead moving to the crash cart she had so meticulously prepared. With a single, fluid motion, she grabbed a 14-gauge catheter and a packet of alcohol swabs. She moved to a gurney shoved against the wall, a young man gasping for air, his face turning a dusky blue, a massive bruise blooming on his chest. A resident was fumbling with an oxygen mask, shouting for a respiratory therapist who was already occupied. Thorne hadn't even seen him. Elara didn't ask for permission. She didn't announce her intentions. She ripped open the man's shirt, swabbed a precise spot between his ribs, and with a practiced, unhesitating thrust, plunged the large-bore needle into his chest. There was a soft hiss of escaping air, and the man's chest, which had been dangerously deviated, settled. His gasp turned into a deep, shuddering breath. Color began to return to his face. Needle decompression, a textbook 18D field procedure. One life saved. She didn't wait for thanks or acknowledgement. She was already moving. Her eyes landed on a woman whose leg was mangled, bleeding profusely from a severed femoral artery. A young nurse was trying to apply pressure with gauze, but the blood was soaking through as fast as she could stack them. The woman's eyes were glassy, her blood pressure plummeting. Elara reached to a small pouch on her own belt, a pouch no one had noticed before, and pulled out a black strap of nylon and a windlass. Acomba application tourniquet. Again, no hesitation. She cinched it high on the woman's thigh, her movements swift and sure, twisting the windlass until the bleeding stopped completely. She took a marker from her pocket and wrote a T in the time on the woman's forehead. 2 lives saved. She moved from patient to patient, a phantom of efficiency. For a man with a sucking chest wound, she slapped on a vented chest seal from her personal kit. For a patient going into shock, she established 2 large-bore IVs with a speed that defied belief, her hands a blur. She identified a subtle abdominal rigidity in a teenage girl that everyone else had missed, flagging her for immediate exploratory surgery for a suspected liver laceration. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. In the space of what felt like an eternity, but was likely less than an hour, she had moved through the 7 most critical patients, the ones who would have died in the chaos, the ones lost in the shuffle of Thorne's collapsing system, and stabilized every single one of them. She wasn't just assisting, she was leading a silent, one-woman counterassault against death itself. The sheer, undeniable competence of her actions began to create its own gravity, pulling the chaos into a new, more efficient orbit around her. Other nurses, seeing her success, began to follow her lead, instinctively recognizing a higher authority than the one who was shouting. The crescendo of noise and panic slowly receded, replaced by a strange, humming quiet. It was the sound of controlled urgency, of a system that had found its rhythm. The frantic shouting had been replaced by low, focused voices. The 7 patients Alara had treated were now being whisked away to operating rooms or intensive care units, their lives pulled back from the brink. The initial wave of the mass casualty event had been weathered, not by the hospital's established leader, but by the quiet, new nurse he had dismissed hours earlier. A profound, almost sacred silence descended upon the main trauma bay. The remaining staff, their adrenaline beginning to ebb, stood amidst the debris of their desperate work. Blood-soaked gauze, discarded wrappers, empty saline bags. But their eyes were all fixed on one person. Alara Vance was standing by a sink, washing the blood from her hands with the same methodical calm she had exhibited throughout the entire ordeal. She showed no signs of triumph, no hint of adrenaline. She simply looked like a worker finishing a difficult task. Dr. Adrian Thorne stood frozen near the nurse's station, a sterile glove still on one hand forgotten. His face, normally a mask of arrogant certainty, was slack with disbelief. He had watched the last 20 minutes as if in a trance. He saw her perform the needle decompression, a procedure he himself had only done a handful of times, and never with such speed or confidence outside of controlled setting. He saw her apply the tourniquet with a brutal efficiency that spoke of countless repetitions. He saw her diagnose and triage with a clarity that cut through the fog of war that had clouded his own judgment. Each action was a direct, irrefutable contradiction to the image he had built of her in his mind. He had dismissed her as a novice, a coffee fetcher. But what he had just witnessed was not nursing. It was something else entirely. It was a level of trauma medicine he had only ever read about in military medical journals, the kind practiced in the dusty, desperate landscapes of faraway battlefields. His mind struggled to reconcile the quiet, unassuming woman before him with the whirlwind of elite medical skill he had just witnessed. His entire worldview, built on a foundation of academic credentials and hospital hierarchy, was crumbling. A single phrase escaped his lips, barely a whisper, but it carried across the silent room. "That's not possible." He wasn't speaking to anyone in particular, but to the universe that had just been upended. No one responded. There was nothing to say. They had all seen it. The evidence was in the 7 lives that were now being saved upstairs, in the newfound order of his emergency room, and in the profound, unsettling silence of the woman who was now calmly drying her hands as if she had just finished washing up after a simple lunch. The automatic doors to the ambulance bay slid open again, but this time it wasn't a gurney that came through. It was 2 men, their presence immediately shifting the atmosphere of the room from one of medical crisis to something else, something colder and more severe. They wore dark, impeccably tailored suits that seemed utterly alien in the blood-spattered environment of the ER. They moved with a shared economy of motion, their eyes scanning the room with a practiced, dispassionate analysis that missed nothing. They weren't cops. They weren't hospital administrators. They radiated an aura of federal authority that was unmistakable. The lead agent, a tall man with sharp features and weary eyes, held up a badge. "FBI, we need to speak with Director Sullivan, and we need to secure this area." His voice was calm, but it carried an absolute, non-negotiable weight. The remaining staff exchanged confused, nervous glances. Dr. Thorne, shaken from his stupor, took a half-step forward. "I'm the chief attending here. What is this about?" The agent's gaze flickered to Thorne, assessed him, and dismissed him in a fraction of a second. His eyes continued to sweep the room until they found what they were looking for. They locked onto Alara Vance. The agent's focus was so intense, so absolute, that it was as if everyone else in the room had ceased to exist. He walked directly toward Alara, his partner moving to intercept a now flustered-looking hospital director Sullivan, who had just emerged from his office. The lead agent didn't look at the blood on the floor or the exhausted staff. He only looked at her, He stopped a respectful distance away, his expression unreadable but for a flicker of something profound in his eyes. Recognition. "Vance," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, a summons. "We have a situation." His voice was low, meant for her alone, but in the echoing silence of the trauma bay, everyone heard it. Alara looked up from the sink, her own calm expression meeting his. She gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Marcus," she acknowledged, her voice just as quiet. The single-word exchange was freighted with a shared history that was utterly alien to this sterile, civilian world. Director Sullivan, a man accustomed to being the highest authority in his hospital, hurried over, his face a mixture of confusion and indignation. "Excuse me, Agent, I'm Director Sullivan. What is the meaning of this? This is a sterile area. Who is this nurse to you?" Agent Marcus turned his head slowly, his gaze finally falling upon the director. He held up a sleek, hardened tablet he was carrying. With a few taps of his thumb, he brought up a file. The screen glowed with a photograph of Alara Vance, but it was not a hospital ID photo. In it, she was younger, her face smudged with camouflage paint, her hair pulled back under a helmet. She wore combat fatigues, and the expression in her eyes was one of lethal seriousness. "I need to confirm the identity of a member of your staff," Marcus said, his voice flat and official. He angled the screen so that both Director Sullivan and Dr. Thorne, who had drifted closer, could see. At the top of the screen, in bold, block letters, were the words, "United States Army Special Operations Command. Personnel file, classified." The room seemed to grow colder. What followed was a cascade of information, a waterfall of credentials that washed away every preconceived notion about the quiet nurse. The narrator's voice in their minds seemed to read it aloud, each line a hammer blow against the walls of their ignorance. Operator, Sergeant First Class Alara Vance, retired. Unit, Joint Special Operations Command, Medical Detachment Alpha. Primary specialty, 18D, Special Forces Medical Sergeant. Secondary specialties, Tactical Combat Casualty Care, TCCC. Instructor, Prolonged Field Care Specialist, CIR Specialist. Combat Deploiement, 8, Location Classifiée. Citations, Silver Star for Valor, for performing life-saving surgery on 3 teammates for 72 hours under direct enemy fire after her field hospital was overrun. Bronze Star with V-Device, for repeatedly exposing herself to hostile fire to rescue and treat wounded soldiers during a convoy ambush. Purple Heart, X2, for injuries sustained in the line of duty. Additional skill sets, Advanced Cardiac Life Support, Pediatric Advanced Life Support, Pre-Hospital Trauma Life Support Instructor, Advanced Trauma Life Support. The list scrolled on, a litany of elite qualifications and heroic acts that was so far beyond the comprehension of a civilian hospital administrator that it might as well have been written in a foreign language. Dr. Thorne stared at the screen, his face ashen. An 18D, a Special Forces Medical Sergeant. The legendary medics of the Green Berets, some of the most highly trained trauma specialists on the planet. They were ghosts, operators who could perform surgery in a ditch with nothing but a knife and sheer will. The needle decompression, the tourniquet, the lightning-fast diagnoses, it all snapped into focus. It wasn't just raw talent. It was the result of thousands of hours of the most intense and demanding medical training ever conceived by the U.S. military, forged in the crucible of active combat. He hadn't just underestimated a new nurse. He had insulted a living legend. Agent Marcus swiped the screen off, the sudden darkness feeling like a final judgment. He turned his full attention back to Alara, his posture shifting subtly. The authoritative air of an FBI agent softened, replaced by the quiet, profound respect reserved for a fellow warrior. He wasn't looking at a nurse anymore. He was looking at Sergeant Vance, a decorated operator from the highest echelons of the special operations community. "Sergeant," he said, his voice now imbued with a reverence that stunned the onlookers. It's an honor he didn't salute. That would have been too overt, too theatrical for this world. But he gave a short, sharp nod, a gesture of deep, mutual understanding that transcended rank and agency. It was the silent acknowledgement of shared sacrifice, of things seen and done that could never be spoken of in a place like this. Director Sullivan stammered, his authority completely gone. I don't understand. Her application said she graduated from the University of North Carolina, a standard nursing program. Agent Marcus turned his gaze back to the director, his expression hardening slightly. Director, Sergeant Vance's transition into the civilian sector is part of a sensitive government program designed to help certain high-value assets decompress and reintegrate. Her cover identity is, for all intents and purposes, legitimate, but it is also, as you can see, profoundly incomplete. We do this to protect their privacy, and frankly, to protect civilians from a knowledge of what these individuals have endured on behalf of their country. His eyes then slid over to Dr. Thorne, and for the first time, they held a glint of cold steel. It's a system that relies on the assumption that people will not be judged on superficialities, an assumption that professional respect is earned through demonstrated competence, not demanded by a title on a lab coat. The rebuke was surgical, precise, and utterly devastating. It landed with the force of a physical blow, and Dr. Thorne visibly flinched. The blood drained from his face, leaving behind a pallid mask of shame and horror. He looked from the implacable face of the federal agent to the quiet, unassuming nurse who was, in reality, one of the most elite combat medics of her generation. He saw the memory of his own words playing in his mind. Fetch coffee and change bedpans. The sheer, monumental arrogance of that statement now threatened to suffocate him. He had stood on his little molehill of authority and presumed to lecture a woman who had climbed a mountain of experience he couldn't even imagine. The silence in the room was now thick with his humiliation. Every nurse, every resident who had laughed nervously at his command was now staring at him, their expressions a mixture of pity and contempt. His authority had not just been challenged, it had been vaporized. He was no longer the king of his chaotic kingdom. He was just a man who had been shown, in the most public and undeniable way possible, that he was a fool. He had mistaken a lioness for a lamb, and she had saved his entire flock while he was still trying to figure out which way the wind was blowing. The legend of Nurse Elara Vance began not as a story, but as a whisper. It started in the stunned silence of the trauma bay and spread outwards, a shockwave of awe and disbelief. It moved through the ER staff first, carried on hushed tones in the break room and linen closets. Did you hear? The new nurse. She's not just a nurse. They said she was Special Forces, an 18D. I looked it up. They're basically surgeons who carry rifles. From there, it jumped floors. It became the topic of conversation over lukewarm coffee in the ICU. A hushed rumor passed between surgeons in the scrub room. By the next day, the entire hospital was buzzing. The story was like a virus, infectious and fast-moving, mutating with each telling but always retaining its core truth. The quiet woman in the plain scrubs was a hero of a different order. The narrative was electrifying. It was a real-life myth unfolding in their hallways. The woman who had been publicly belittled, the one assigned the most menial tasks, had single-handedly tamed a mass casualty event with a level of skill that left their most arrogant doctor speechless. It was a story of vindication so perfect, so complete, that it felt like something out of a movie. The whispers followed Elara down the corridors. The gazes that used to slide past her without a second thought now lingered, filled with a mixture of reverence and a little bit of fear. People made way for her. Residents who had once casually ignored her now fell silent when she entered a room, their eyes wide with questions they would never dare to ask. She, however, remained utterly unchanged by the sudden notoriety. She arrived for her next shift on time, her scrubs just as crisp, her bun just as tight. She went about her duties with the same quiet, methodical efficiency. She stocked the carts, she checked the monitors, she answered call lights. To the casual observer, she was the same unassuming nurse. But to those who knew, her every action was now viewed through a new lens. Her calm was no longer seen as passivity, but as unbreakable composure. Her silence was not shyness, but profound confidence. Her efficiency was not just good work ethic, but the ingrained discipline of an elite operator. She had become a legend in Scrubs, a ghost who had revealed herself for one spectacular, life-altering hour and then faded back into the background, her mystique only deepening with her humility. The most profound change, however, was in Dr. Adrian Thorne. The event had shattered his ego, but in its place, something new and better began to grow: humility. For 2 days after the incident, he avoided Alara, his shame a palpable aura around him. He was quieter, more withdrawn. His usual booming commands in the ER were replaced by more measured requests. The staff watched this transformation with a kind of cautious wonder. The tyrant was gone, replaced by a man who seemed lost, a king dethroned and wandering in his own fallen kingdom. On the third day, he found her in a quiet alcove, restocking a pediatric trauma kit. He approached her not with his usual swagger, but with the hesitant steps of a penitent. She didn't look up as he approached, her hands continuing their precise work. He stood there for a long moment, struggling with the words. "Vance," he began, his voice uncharacteristically soft. He cleared his throat and started again. "Sergeant Vance." She finally paused, looking up at him, her expression neutral. He swallowed hard, the words catching in his throat. "I was wrong. Well, I said to you, what I did, there is no excuse. It was arrogant, and it was ignorant. I am sorry." The apology hung in the air between them, simple, direct, and utterly sincere. Alara simply nodded. Apology accepted. Dr. Thorne seemed to expect more. A lecture, dismissal, a moment of triumph from her. But none came. Her forgiveness was as quiet and efficient as her medical work. He took a deep breath, emboldened by her lack of malice. "What you did with those patients, I've never seen anything like it. The speed, the precision. The protocols you used were not in any of our textbooks." He looked at her, his eyes filled not with arrogance, but with a genuine, desperate thirst for knowledge. Would you be willing to teach us? To show the residents, to show me, how you did that?" This was his true act of contrition. It was an admission that she knew more than he did, that she had something to offer that he desperately needed. It was the ultimate reversal of their initial dynamic. He was no longer the teacher. He was the student. Alara looked at him, truly looked at him for the first time. She saw the broken pride, but also the flicker of a genuine desire to be better, to learn, to save more lives. Her mission had always been twofold: to heal the wounded and to make her teammates better. These people were now her team. "I can do that," she said, her voice even. "We'll start with tactical triage in a mass casualty. The old rules don't apply." A small, almost imperceptible plaque was later mounted on the wall of the main trauma bay, the one she had commanded with such silent authority. It didn't bear her name. It simply read, "In recognition of extraordinary competence under pressure," but everyone knew who it was for. The space became known colloquially among the staff as Vance's Corner, the place where a legend had been born and a tyrant had been humbled. It was a constant, quiet reminder of the day they all learned that true worth isn't worn on a sleeve or announced with a title, but is revealed in action when it matters most. The changes in the St. Michael's ER were not immediate, but they were deep and lasting. Months after the Day of the Seven, as it came to be known, the entire department operated with a new ethos. Alara, at Thorne's insistence, began holding weekly training sessions. They were not lectures in a comfortable conference room. They were high-stress simulations held in the trauma bay itself, using advanced mannequins and realistic scenarios. She taught them the principles of tactical combat casualty care, adapted for a civilian setting. She showed them how to control catastrophic hemorrhaging in under 30 seconds, how to perform needle decompressions, how to manage airways in the most austere conditions. Her teaching style was direct, practical, and stripped of all ego. She never raised her voice. She corrected mistakes with a quiet word, a guiding hand. She explained the why behind every action, linking it back to the brutal lessons learned in places they could only imagine. "In the field, you don't have the luxury of time or resources," she would explain, her voice calm amidst the simulated chaos. "Every second, every movement must have a purpose. Efficiency is life." Dr. Thorne became her most dedicated student. He shed the skin of the arrogant attending and embraced the role of a learner with a zeal that surprised everyone. He was the first to arrive at her training sessions and the last to leave. He asked more questions than any of the residents. He was rebuilding himself, brick by brick, on a new foundation of humility and respect for a different kind of knowledge. The results were undeniable. The trauma response team's efficiency skyrocketed. Their cohesion as a unit improved dramatically. The old, fear-based hierarchy was replaced by a collaborative environment where a nurse's observation was given the same weight as a doctor's diagnosis. They learned to trust each other's skills, not their titles. The hospital survival rates for critical trauma patients, particularly in multi-victim incidents, began to climb, eventually becoming the best in the state. The story of Alara Vance became institutional folklore, a foundational myth for every new employee. On their first day, new residents and nurses were no longer given a simple tour. They were brought to Vance's corner, shown the small plaque, and told the story. It was a lesson, a warning, and an inspiration all at once. It taught them to look beyond appearances, to value competence over confidence, and to understand that the person they might be tempted to dismiss could be the one they would one day owe their lives to. Alara herself never sought the spotlight. She deflected praise, refused interviews, and continued her work as a floor nurse. She found a quiet satisfaction in seeing her team grow stronger, more capable. Her war was over, but her mission to save lives and make her people better continued. She had brought the most vital lessons from the battlefield to the home front, not with medals and stories, but with the quiet, daily practice of her craft. She was a living testament to the idea that true strength is not about the noise you make, but about the impact you have when the world is falling apart. She had traded her fatigues for scrubs, but she was, and always would be, a guardian. Years later, a young, nervous resident found himself in the middle of another mass casualty event, a bus rollover on a rain-slicked highway. The ER exploded into controlled chaos, but it was a different kind of chaos now. It was the organized, efficient system that Alara had built. The resident was tasked with a critically injured patient, a man with a crushed chest, gasping for air. Panic began to set in, the textbook pages in his mind blurring together. Then he saw Dr. Thorne, now the ER director, moving calmly through the fray. Thorne caught his eye, saw the fear, and pointed to the patient. "What do you see, doctor?" he asked, his voice firm but encouraging. The resident stammered. Possible tension pneumothorax?" Thorne nodded. "Good. What's the protocol?" The resident looked toward the crash cart, his hand hesitating. He saw the large-bore needle, and his fear intensified. He had only ever done it on a mannequin. Thorne put a steadying hand on his shoulder. "You've trained for this. I've seen you do it a dozen times in simulation. Trust your training. Trust the protocol." Sergeant Vance's protocol. The name was like an incantation, a source of strength. The resident took a deep breath, his panic receding, replaced by a cold, clear focus. He grabbed the needle, and his hands, though trembling slightly, moved with the muscle memory Alara had drilled into them. He performed the procedure flawlessly. The hiss of air, the patient's sudden, deep breath. It was exactly as she had taught. He just saved a life. Later, after the chaos had subsided, Dr. Thorne found the young resident staring at the plaque in Vance's corner. "She's not here anymore, you know," Thorne said quietly. Alara had eventually moved on, her work at St. Michael's done, seeking another quiet place where she could make a difference without fanfare. "They say she works in a rural clinic in the mountains now," the resident nodded, still in awe. "Her name isn't even on it. But everyone knows exactly," Thorne said, a sad, wise smile on his face. "That's the point. True legacy isn't what you carve into a wall. It's not about the name on the plaque or the medals in a box. It's what continues forward after you're gone. It's the knowledge you pass on, the standards you set, the lives that are saved by the people you taught." He looked around his ER at the competent, confident team he now led, a team he had learned to lead by first learning how to follow. He was a different man, a better doctor, a better leader, all because of the quiet nurse he had once so foolishly dismissed. The quietest lessons are often the most profound, echoing not in our ears, but in our actions, long after the teacher has departed. For more stories where quiet competence triumphs over loud assumption, and where silent discipline defines their worth, subscribe to Unknown Heroine Tales.